Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the International Tax and Investment Center, which set up a lot of the tax regimes in the former Soviet Union. And joining us is Dr. Ariel Cohen, who was a long time with the Heritage Foundation, now a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council as well. Ariel, good to see you again. You've got some of the coolest pictures, by the way, in your room, because I think, any room that's got a mini bust of Vladimir Putin all the way up to a picture of Nursultan Nazarbayev is pretty cool in my book.
Gorbachev and Thatcher.
And Gorbachev and Thatcher as well. You wrote a thought-provoking essay in Forbes about how the international community should be responding to Iran. Obviously, the United Nations General Assembly meeting is ongoing. Iranians on a little bit of a charm offensive. All European powers are agreeing with the United States that the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure were, in fact, by Iran and not by Houthis, as has been claimed. Iranians have said, for example, the British oil tanker that they seized in international waters is free to go. From your standpoint, what's the way for the international community to deal with this? Because if you look at it, it's been one sort of Iranian provocation after another that's gone unpunished ultimately, which is why we're in this position.
Well, it's not just a provocation. From the international law point of view, this was an act of aggression, unabashed aggression. And if the United Nations now is not going to take steps to stop and repel that aggression, that will be a bankruptcy of the United Nations as an organization, as an institution. Secondly, the United States had played a major role in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf since 1945, since the historic meeting between President Roosevelt in the last months of his life and King Abdulaziz, the founder of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And in that meeting that was in the Suez Canal on board of a U.S. ship, the U.S. essentially took upon itself the role that until then the British Empire played in the Gulf and in the Arabian Peninsula to be the provider of security of the last resort. Today we're tested. Whether we can rise up to that test or not will define the American stature, not just in that region, not just in the Gulf, where the most important flow of oil of this blood of our economy is flowing, but our stature as the superpower all over the world. And let me tell you, for sure, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other bad guys are watching us like a hawk.
I should have said that you're also the founder of the International Market Analysis of International Market Analysis. I think there are a lot of people who would agree with you, and one of the criticisms made of the president is, for example, when the strike happened on Syria, the Syrians had 90 minutes of warning, for example. So the strike that was designed to be punitive against the Syrian regime for having used chemical weapons was not altogether that effective. We had the RQ-4, the American drone that was shot down. The president decided to press ahead with the cyber attack, but not the kinetic attack for fear of causing casualties. It's often been said by strategists that the United States sometimes has to respond to a mosquito bite with a sledgehammer as a message more globally to send. What are the next steps? If you were advising President Trump, what would be the next steps that he should take? What are the next steps that the international community has to take? Because even France, even Germany and the United Kingdom that have generally been supportive of Iran and the old deal are now saying, hey, look, Iran has to be held to task for this. What are the next steps?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The Europeans are now, as they always do, are crying, Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam, come here and do something because we, the Europeans, who neglected our security, neglected our military power, cannot do it ourselves. That's point number one. Point number two, we are really in a trying period of our history. Look, on the same day, the British went into a more advanced stage of their slow-moving political meltdown, and the United States is moving towards impeaching the president. So we are not doing well politically internally. But you're asking a very important question. What can the international community and what can we as the United States do? So two things. The international community at the UNGA should, in my view, adopt a resolution, a Security Council resolution, that allows countermeasures, including military countermeasure force, to be applied against the Islamic Republic of Iran to prevent future attacks. What does that mean? It means that those military capabilities that were used from the Iranian territory or by the Iranian military and paramilitary forces, such as the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, can and should be put in play. That's point number one. Point number two, as the provider of security of last resort, not just here, not just in the Middle East, but also in the Pacific and in Europe, with three main theaters: Northern Pacific, Eastern and Central Europe, and the Middle East. The United States needs to send a message to the leaders of Iran that those assets that they value the most, not population centers, not historic treasures that are protected by UNESCO, but things that they treasure. It can be the oil terminal at Kharg Island. It can be the military headquarters. It can be the nuclear program, reactors, enrichment factories, and whatnot. Those assets are taking out not just proportionally, but above and beyond of the damage that they made. And the damage they made, people don't realize what it means for Saudi Arabia. It means that their oil is producing 85% of their GDP. So imagine 85% of our GDP, half of that, 40+% of our industrial capacity, is taken out by a missile attack by China and Russia. What would be our reaction? Unfortunately, I need the viewers to understand that should such a horrible disaster hit us, there may be no Russia and no China next day, I hope, right? They would be facing a nuclear retaliation for something like that. Of course, Saudi Arabia now is pushed by the Islamic Republic of Iran to procure nuclear weapons. And they have so much money, even if they don't have a terrific engineering capability yet, with so much money, just like Iran did with less money, they can train the engineers. And this is old technology. Nuclear technology is 70+ years old. It appeared in the early 40s. So they can buy that technology. And unfortunately, as we saw with the AQ Khan network 25 years ago, there were people already available to sell it to the highest bidder. And I know from my sources that the Iranians were buying a lot of this technology from Russia, also paying cash.
Of course, it's been reported for a long time that the Pakistan nuclear program was in part supported by the Saudi Arabians to be able to have proxy access to
Correct.
a weapon, along with the Chinese intermediate range rockets they have, which are also nuclear capable, that are kept in inventory. You mentioned about the magnitude of the attack on Saudi Arabia. Give us a little bit of a deeper understanding, right? Because folks have a tendency of thinking, well, there was a lot of fire and these were little drones, but it was actually a very, very sophisticated attack. Walk us through the attack and why it was so meaningful and so destructive.
The attack indeed is for the textbooks. It was highly effective. I think it was 25 or 29 platforms launched. And it wasn't just drones, it was also cruise missiles. And they hit the tanks, the storage tanks, exactly where they're supposed to hit. Came from the north. The Houthis, if they shot it, would not have the capability to fly around the tank and hit it from the north to point to the Iranians. No, of course not. These were assets shot from the Iranian and possibly Iraqi border area in Khuzestan, the Arab populated province in Iran. That's point number one. Point number two, they knew when to hit. They hit on the night between Friday and Saturday when this was the weekend. And most probably the 6-minute flight that the warning that they may have had, if they were awake, was not sufficient to wake up the general to give the order to shoot those attacking missiles and drones down. That's point number one. Point number two, they hit Abu Qayyq. I wargamed a hit on Abu Qayyq 10 years ago. We speculated that that would be Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda tried, indeed, and failed to destroy Abu Qayyq. Now Abu Qayyq, which is the main Saudi oil processing facility that is located on the intersection of north-south and east-west pipelines, and processes 7 million barrels a day. We, the United States, import 3 million. So imagine it's 2.5 times our import capacity. So much oil. Saudis are producing close to 10 million barrels a day. This is 70%, more than 70% of what they are producing. So that was number one. And number two, the field that was hit is a 1.5 million barrel a day, huge field. I think it's maybe second in Saudi, right next to the Ghadar field that is largest in the world. So the Saudis got a ringer that all of their oil economy, all of their oil assets is at play. This is an existential threat to the number one market maker in the oil industry. Thank God we have a large strategic petroleum reserve that was ordered by President Bush 43. We have something between 200, depends on the day, 200 to 300 days. The Japanese probably have 3 months of strategic petroleum reserve, meaning how much of oil we import and how much that can be covered by the import. And if the Iranians are smart, which they are, clearly, with the planning of this operation, the execution, also they hit after the oil futures trade was closed. I would order, if I was tasking the intelligence community, I would order a forensic exploration of who and where made this money on the oil options, because somebody did. Those people knew. I would get those people and start pulling the string who gave them the information, because those are the people who gave the information are the people who knew and who ordered. And clearly the Iranians made money on those options. And we're lucky also for another reason. People don't know that there was a big banking holiday in Asia, so the Asian markets didn't have time to react in panic. And that also allowed the damage of 10% increase of the oil price to be contained. If it was in the middle of the week, the damage would be much more. In my estimates, probably twice as much. So instead of a 10%, it would be 20% increase in the oil prices. Finally, if the Iranians are smart, as I said, which they are, they would wait till the Saudis repair and then hit again. And at that point, if we didn't fill up the strategic petroleum reserves, we would not have what to fill the market with. So in my book, unfortunately, very unfortunately, we were tested. We were tested in June when they hit the tankers. And also, they hit the tankers with these non-explosive warheads to send a message. They hit some of the tanks with non-explosive warheads, sending the message. If they're not stopped, they will keep the escalation. They think that they can play the escalation game, not understanding that we ultimately, the United States, will win the escalation domination game.
I should point out that earlier this year we talked to Dr. Uzi Rubin of the Begin Sadat Center, who's one of the fathers of the Arrow missile defense system, and he talked to us in great detail about Iran's missile capabilities and especially the sophistication with which Iran has struck targets in Iraq, in particular, to try to eliminate some of the Kurdish leaders in the area. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes. The accuracy of the Iranian navigation system, how the gyroscopes work, how the navigation works, suggests that the Iranians today can hit with pinpoint accuracy almost any target in the Middle East, even protected targets. that puts in play the big civilian airports throughout the region, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, etc. Probably puts the Israeli civilian airport, Ben Gurion, big airport, and also, unfortunately, the Israeli nuclear reactor in Dimona. What does that mean? That means, again, that the Iranians made a step up the escalation domination game, because if something like Dimona is hit, or Ben Gurion, which is the only big Israeli airport with international ties, the Israelis may retaliate with all they have, and we can only speculate what they have. So the Iranians are playing a very, very dangerous game here.
Last question. Do you think that ratcheting up sanctions even higher is probably the best intermediate step to make clear that any other provocation will be met by force, and then try to do what every government has done? And I think this administration deserves credit for that, although I have to say the last administration did put very, very tough sanctions as well on the Iranian government, but this administration has ratcheted those up, and to do it in a much more concerted, much more focused global way.
I don't think so. I think while sanctions are weakening the regime, and the popular discontent in Iran is a real danger of the regime. The reason the Iranians are escalating now is because, in their estimate, the lifespan of that regime is shrinking. They're not making any money exporting the oil. Their oil is down from 3.5 million barrels a day to 700. And they think that they maybe have a couple of years left, and after that, all bets are off. I think that to send a message to that regime that no, they cannot use force, is to take out those particular targets that the Iranian regime values more. Can be the nuclear program, can be big command and control centers. And when, for example, Israelis did that, the Iranians did not react, not in Syria and not elsewhere. So I think there has to be a balance of sanctions and, shall we say, more kinetic or maybe more cyber response, but much more robust, and incapacitating the Iranian military command, control, and communication and intelligence probably would make a lot of sense.
Well, a follow-up to that then. I mean, do you think, how do you respond to those people who say, and Zarif, but also Khamenei has also said the same thing, where if we get poked, we are going to, turn the Gulf into a sea of fire. I mean, we know all of the rhetoric that comes out of the Iranians, but there are people who are very senior and thoughtful people in the U.S. military and national security community who go, there are a lot of direct levers and a lot of proxy levers that Iran can pull that can make everybody's life difficult, right? I mean, whether we want to admit it or not, Iran was a partner in defeating ISIS, for example, in Iraq and in Syria. How do you respond to those who say that even if we do targeted surgical strikes, it's likely to set off a larger conflict that may be very, very hard to control?
I think this ultimately should be a political strategic decision and not a military decision. The military is here to execute the political decisions. Of course, their opinion is valued, but also in the Middle East, we saw again and again over decades, U.S. decision makers misread the map. And as you said, the rhetoric, sea of fire, this is the ultimate war, whatever. This is how people in the Middle East talk. I think the U.S. should look at it not just from the perspective of our relationship with the Saudis, but from the perspective of, number one, how important the Gulf still is, and if it's not important to us today, what is the meaning of us abandoning the Gulf region and China, maybe with some Russian help, because the Russians are dying to sell S-400s, nuclear reactors, Sukhoi 35s, everything, to the Gulf states. Gulf states still have a lot of money. And if we are out of that region and creating a vacuum, my question is, who is going to fill that vacuum?
The one question which I didn't ask you earlier before we go, which I have to ask you, which was one of the original questions in the line of the interview, was going to be, how resilient are international oil prices right now? You have a larger investment in fossil-free fuels, whether on wind power, solar power. So there are a number of alternatives that are even picking up the slack after nuclear reactors are going to be decommissioned. How much elasticity is there in the global oil and fossil fuel market to cushion shocks like this?
A very good question. We are clearly much more resilient than we were even 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, the big crisis of 2008 when oil reached 150, or the Arab embargo of the 1970s and Iran-Iraq war. We're much more resilient. Why? The main reason for that is the U.S. shale capacity. We are producing great amounts, and if prices go up, guess what? Those shale plays that are not profitable today will be profitable at 75 or 90, right? So there's a lot of potential there. Let us not confuse the electricity generation that comes from the renewables, and it doesn't come from renewables in those big numbers, maybe 7% on a good day, with transportation. As long as the electric cars are in single digits from the total, there's no fungibility of oil and gas. Yes, if we have 10, 15, 20, 30% of all cars riding like my car, electric, then even further, the decline in oil supply or increase in oil prices is not going to affect. How much this crisis with Saudi Arabia is going to affect my transportation bill? Zero, as long as the gas, shale gas made in the United States, remains cheap. And the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, right? So I can charge my car. What I think this is an opportunity for us to think about is this anti-electric car or pro-gas guzzling cars policy that this administration is pursuing from the strategic perspective makes a lot of sense in my book now. I don't mind small cars at all. I'm 6 feet and fit them there very nicely. But the main thing is pollution. The bill, actually, you spend much, much less money driving an electric car, and this is not a plug for electric cars. This is a more strategic consideration. In the developing countries, to a lesser degree in Europe, they're still driving mostly gasoline cars, and maybe they need to start thinking about those tax policies, those regulatory environmental policies that encourage electric locomotion and electric mobility. But this is way beyond the strategic discussion about Iran. What I'm trying to say here is, think about it for a second. Venezuela, a big oil country, went into a total meltdown. Iran is poking and pushing about to bring on itself possibly the wrath of the world. And if that wrath doesn't come, it will be only worse. So that tells me that these big oil producers, we have to be very, very careful, and we need to do the contingency planning for what happens when they go through this painful transformation as the role of oil in the world will continue to decline.
Dr. Ariel Cohen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council here at the International Tax and Investment Center, and also the founder of International Market Analysis. Thanks very much, and check out his column on Forbes.com. Ariel, thanks very much. Good to talk to you, and look forward to staying in touch. This is a topic, unfortunately, that's not going away anytime soon.
Thank you.